Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to this evening's keynote address by Professor Maria Medved. Um, I'm actually speaking to you from Vancouver. It's 9 a.m. in the morning here and rainy, but I'm hoping that it's sunny wherever you are. And the wonderful thing about this conference is that we can tune in from so many different places. So it's an honor to be able to introduce Professor Medved and also to be given the opportunity to moderate her talk, which I know will generate a lot of interest and promises a good discussion. Professor Medved teaches at the American University of Paris and is also an adjunct professor of psychology at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She is additionally a health psychologist with experience in clinical and neuropsychology. Her interests include how narratives of risk and resilience are told by individuals and their families with various health conditions, whether neurological, physical, or psychological, and the ways in which these narratives are shaped across different cultures and contexts. Professor Medved has published in a wide array of areas, ranging from mental health seeking in indigenous communities to how individuals adjust to amnesia. In fact, I encourage all of you to look at her ResearchGate page, which enables you to peruse her fascinating articles and chapters and gives you a sense of her deep and searching scholarship in the field. A fellow Canadian, Professor Medved has multiple degrees from the University of Toronto and has taught in Manitoba, New York, and now Paris. I've had the pleasure of knowing Maria over the past decade and of sharing lovely meals and days with her, and be it in Paris or most recently last June in Berlin. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Medved.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Roger. I'd also like to thank the attendees for being here, wherever you may be, from Vancouver to Paris to Vancouver again. Lastly, I'd also like to acknowledge the invisible hand helping out with the moderation behind the scenes, Tim Munster. Before I start, I'd like to mention that I've altered the emphasis of my presentation. As I was writing, a new idea emerged, as it is so often does when one sits down to finally put some thoughts into words. So my talk is mostly on mental health, with some attention on physical health. In the time of COVID-19, my focus is on men. How has your mental health been lately? Are you scared for your future? Unable to sleep? Maybe sleeping too much? Suffering from loneliness? Mourning the loss of your own old life? Feeling detached from yourself and the world? If so, you are not alone. Everywhere you look these days, you read headlines like the tsunami of psychological sickness, the explosion of mental illness, psychological clinics are overwhelmed, the heavy mental toll of the pandemic on individuals, communities, countries, in fact, on the world. Both the United Nations and the World Health Organization recently pronounced that COVID-19 is likely to lead to a global mental health crisis. We're suffering increased levels of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, loneliness, psychosis, acute stress disorder, and so forth. Around the world, there are increased levels of interpersonal violence against partners and children. People with dementia are fading away from lack of stimulation. There's grief. There's unresolved grief of not being able to say goodbye to a loved one. We're even suffering from lockdown dreams, actually nightmares that are unusually vivid. It is thought that these are due to the lack of sensory stimulation during extended lockdown periods. As a clinical psychologist, when I talk to my fellow colleagues in the clinics, these headlines appear to reflect with what they're dealing with right now. Mental health support lines report a 300% increase of calls. In view of COVID-19, this increase of psychological distress is not entirely surprising. Perhaps the worldwide scale is new, but researchers and clinicians are well aware that traumatic events, which substantially challenge our being in the world, intensifies the need for mental health services and for individuals, especially for those who have what is labeled as premorbid psychological conditions. That is challenges that people were already grappling with before the pandemic. People with eating disorders say that they are having difficulty regulating their eating. Some are not eating enough, while others are eating too much. People with obsessive compulsive disorder can no longer gauge what is normal. In relation to hand washing, for example, the signposts have moved, and what was once considered excessive might be considered right now just right. Individuals struggling with drug and alcohol abuse have difficulty escaping their spatial, social, and other types of triggers. Not surprisingly, just published in psychiatry research is the first case of COVID-19 paranoia in a person with schizophrenia. It is well known that the content of psychosis and delusions reflects the fears dominant in one's culture. What ties these mental health crises together is that the psychological context of the pandemic exacerbates existing psychological problems. It influences the manifestation of their symptoms, both in terms of quantity and quality. But hidden among the avalanche of research and statistics is an observation that I find especially intriguing, one that does not fit this pattern. This is that mental health professionals are seeing people, and I quote, people who are not known to services who are acutely unwell. They are mainly young men, aged 18 to 25 years, who require admission brought in by their families, unquote. It was observed that the young men coped especially poorly with confinement. They were more likely to not adhere to lockdown and were described as walking around like zombies. I found this phenomenon most curious, how to understand it, how to interpret it. Before I share some thoughts, not answers, that I have about this, I'd like to highlight that, oopsie, lost my spot. I'd like to highlight that men are also at risk physically from COVID-19, that there are gendered physical response to the virus as well, in addition to the psychological one I just mentioned. Although there are many unknowns regarding this virus, what does seem clear is that men with the coronavirus have a significantly higher mortality rate than women. Just 2 days ago, Le Monde reported that men are twice as likely to die with the virus than women. And again, the question is why? Well, there are numerous hypotheses regarding this medical finding. One group of hypotheses concerns the biological immunity system of men. Our immune system is on the X chromosome, of which men have 1 and women have 2. Thus, the immune system is more active in women than men. Another one is that estrogen is protective, as it is known to promote antiviral responses of the immune system. But there are also cultural hypotheses. Previous research has shown that men wash their hands less than women and are less likely to use soap. And yes, Researchers follow people into the washrooms. So in the future, be careful what you do. Globally, more men than women smoke, particularly in China where COVID emerged, an activity that often involves shared cigarettes and lighters. More generally, men are less likely to follow health promotion advice, including the wearing of masks. All of this could extend exposure to the virus. This is important as there's a suggestion that it is not only a one-time exposure to the virus that is key, but it is also the extent of the exposure to the virus that is influential. But to return to the psychological health of young men, coping poorly, being admitted to psychiatric clinics, reportedly walking around like zombies. How can we think about this? We are actually not the first to observe this kind of behavior in young men during periods of lockdown, nor are we the first to try to understand it. I would like to refer to a historical case study that was recorded in the mid to late 1800s in France. There were numerous cases like this one during that time and throughout Europe. I've edited a few things out for the purposes of time. So this is a medical case report here. It all began one morning last July when we noticed a young man crying in his bed in the clinic. He had just come from a long journey on foot and was exhausted, but that was not the cause of his tears. He wept because he could not prevent himself from departing on a trip when the need took him. He deserted family, work, and daily life to walk as fast as he could, sometimes doing about 70 kilometers a day on foot, until he would be arrested for vagrancy and thrown into prison. The young man's name was Albert. Why is there always an Albert in psychology? I'm not sure. Anyway, he was an occasional, note, a member of the gig economy employee of the local gas company. He became notorious for his extraordinary expeditions to Algeria, Moscow, and other exotic locales. He traveled obsessively, bewitched, often without identity papers, and sometimes without identity, not knowing who he was or why he traveled. He knew only where he was going next. When he came to, he had little recollection of where he had been or even who he was. Those of you who are clinicians will recognize this description as a type of dissociative disorder, a type of de-individuation. Dissociative disorders involve extreme problems with memory, identity, emotion, perception, behavior, and sense of self. One can experience what is called depersonalization, experiences of unreality or detachment from one's mind and body and self. Derealization, a detachment from one's surroundings. And amnesia, one can have gaps in their memory, whether it be of a selected time span or of a localized event. And a dissociative fugue, and fugue is the Latin word for flight, is a psychological state in which a person loses awareness of their identity, their memories, engages in sudden and unplanned travel. This is what we see in Albert. Well, dissociation is a fascinating topic in its own right. What I want to draw your attention to are the historical parallels with what we are observing in the present. One strong parallel is the social context in which this behavior was observed. The mid to late 1800s was a time of conscription in France. Men, and in particular young precariously employed men, were expected to stay in place. These fugers had all sorts of problems, and it was observed that they were curiously powerless in the face of their daily lives. In his book, Mad Travelers, Ian Hacking argues that we can attempt to understand the men's behavior if we view it as a middle option between what he calls cultural polarity vectors. So on the one side, there's the tourist vector. The tourism industry was accelerating as it became easier and easier for the middle class to travel due to the development of the railway systems in Europe at the time. On the other side, there is the vagrancy factor, vector. Travel for the lower classes, for the curiously powerless, was viewed with suspicion, as it was associated with petty crime, disease, and all-round social disorder. Hacking goes on to argue that these men were caught between two opposing cultural vectors. Traveling by society was admired, yet disdained, encouraged, yet forbidden, reassuring, yet feared, wise, yet reckless. So we understand, walking while in a dissociated state was the best option available to these men to provide a psychological release. In contemporary societies, what sorts of cultural vectors are pulling at men? Wearing my hat as a health psychologist, I immediately thought of the literature on gender and health. They are caught between the don't care vector and the should care vector in their health or medical decision-making. Let's start with the don't care vector. Simply put, real men don't care for their health. Historically, men must perform strength. This means that help seeking for sickness, engaging in self-care, and being conscious of one's health are activities for the weak and feeble. Expression of emotions is coded as feminine, a threat to masculinity, even though such inhibition, we know, heightens men's sense of isolation. Denial of sickness, especially psychological challenges, is a means to demonstrate being in control and powerful. In a healthcare system, the don't care vector leads to men being labeled as, irresponsible, a drain on resources, they came in too late, because they often do present themselves very late into a disease. And consequently, they often suffer worse health outcomes. So that is another hypothesis about the increased death rate of men with COVID-19. Maybe they are sicker when they finally do arrive in a hospital. Contrarily, there is an opposing yet simultaneous cultural vector, the should care vector. As morally good citizens, even men are expected to care, expected to be sensitive to their health needs, whether physical or psychological. This is what an in-charge, responsible man does. They safeguard not only their own health, but also the health of others. They do not just let themselves go, so to speak. Undergirding this should care vector is a loosening of what it means to be masculine, with more cultural options available than the traditional hegemonic one. There are complicit masculinities, marginalized masculinities, feminized masculinities. There are more and more gradients, differentiations, variations of masculinity. Young men, or at least some young men, have grown up alongside this emerging cultural vector. In fact, In the psychology literature on mental health, and this is also the case in terms of physical health of boys and male adolescents, there is a storyline cropping up that they are too body focused, they're too sensitive, they're too fragile. School psychologists are well aware that boys appear to be increasingly at risk, psychologically, educationally, and academically. Turning again to these two cultural vectors, how do young men negotiate between the pull of these two opposing forces? Just take this one contradiction. On the one hand, we are all expected to stay safe, stay at home. This would be the responsible and the right thing to do. This is the pull of the should care vector. Yet on the other hand, to stay in place, to sit around and ruminate is anything but a suitable health directive for young men. During COVID-19, we know that young men and men in general are more likely to go out, mingle, and flout social distancing rules. This is the pull of the don't care vector, where action and activity demonstrating courage and toughness are given primacy over health. For young men of today, like the young European men of the 1800s, walking like a zombie would be a good middle ground. In sum, one of the themes of this conference and many of the talks that I've attended is that the COVID-19 crisis is amplifying what is already present in our world. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that events which threaten our being in the world, which overturn what we think we know, escalates the need for mental health services. For individuals who already have psychological challenges, this pandemic will magnify their distress, both in terms of quantity and quality of symptoms. Many commentators argue that in times of crisis, gender is not a priority. Right now, we just don't have the time nor the resources. In my talk, I've tried to challenge this idea. Gender is, in fact, a central issue here. I have defended this claim by taking a look at the unique vulnerability and struggle of men. In older men, with their increased risk of mortality, in younger men, with their increased risk of psychological dysfunction. In 2 words, gender matters. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria. That was a terrific talk. Really fascinating. And I, as a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, also very much appreciate it, since much of what you said is highly topical from a therapeutic perspective, as well, of course, from a broader psychological and social philosophical perspective. So I certainly have a few questions, but before I begin, I just want to let everyone know that the question and answer section is open, and what you can do is write in your questions, and then I'll be able to read them out for Maria, and we'll be able to discuss them. So the question and answer tool is waiting for you, and please feel free. But maybe we can begin by going over some of the key points. First of all, I really appreciate the fact that you brought in gender. And it's an obvious and yet, as you point out, often overlooked concern. And it is perhaps specifically within this field and the issue of the mental health of young men and of men in general, I often have the impression is neglected somewhat, and the challenges involved from a clinical perspective of working with men of different age groups. One of the things you did was you also brought in the historical parallels that I thought were fascinating. And you used the example of the young man who might be diagnosed with dissociation disorder and was walking aimlessly from country to country. In an ideal world, we would all be able to walk aimlessly from country to country. In fact, I love that image since I long for it. And thinking about that historical parallel, I guess the question that comes up to my mind and in the minds of, I would imagine, many viewers as well, is what might we prescribe for these young men who aren't able today to walk aimlessly from country to country? Not that that's going to resolve the issues, clearly, but what kind of responses might there be that we could think about together as we try to make sense of what they're experiencing?
Mhm. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's a really, I mean, that's kind of the kernel of the talk. And it's not easy to know how to engage with young men or men in general in a psychotherapeutic context. Partially for some of the reasons that I brought up. It's kind of viewed as a bit feminized, you know, it's talking, um, it's kind of weak, although, you know, but there's that other polarity, that other vector going on at the same time. And I think, you know, some of the initiatives that are going on to engage men were quite interesting. I'm thinking of one initiative that I did with some colleagues of mine at the University of Manitoba, where the Men's Sheds program. So the Men's Sheds program actually is a program for older men who have retired, who are really isolated. And they're not going to go for therapy. There's also a generational issue. So the idea of a men's shed is it's quite literally a shed with tools.
Hmm.
And the men go there and they build things for the community, or they help each other out. The tools are there. Many men no longer have these. And it's in that act of doing that, if you want to label it that, psychotherapy happens. There's a community, there's social interaction, but there's not this pressure that you need to talk about your feelings, but they come out. And I think zones like that are just so important and key for men of all ages.
Mhm.
So the idea that you're going to now to talk to somebody, it's kind of hard for some men, but having situations where these interactions are supported, where one can talk in passing, which is a more kind of stereotypically male way of talking about feelings, or trying to articulate feelings, I think is really important for young men. So right now we're supposed to stay at home. So it needs to be on the internet. Communities that are somewhat supervised, so not totally just, you know, let's just get together and hash things out, but where the theme is something slightly different than talking about mental health. I don't know, you know, let's talk about movies, or
Yeah.
let's talk about this. And in that kind of interaction, I think is one way to engage men. Um, Not all men, but I think a lot of young men would help. That would be more
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah.
We have a question here that I'd like to read to you. Um, Someone again is thanking you for focusing on the gender-based aspects of the psychological effects of regulations during the pandemic. Um, and the question regards the consequences that stem from these regulations. And the question is, lately, some countries have debated whether the right to life really is absolute, or whether we should pay more attention to its dignity of life. This question and change regulations, or the way we relate to human health in general. I'm not sure I quite grasp the question, but I think the issue is how do we impose regulations? How do we create regulations? And the regulations referring back to things such as the right to life and dignity of life, and how are they, I think essentially, Maria, created?
Okay, well, that's a very wide-ranging question.
Yes.
As someone that works in a clinic, I'm going to kind of pare that right down to the concrete. What do you do with the person when they're in front of you? Um, so what popped to mind when I was saying that, saying the idea, for example, some countries are struggling with the idea of mask wearing. Okay, given aside of whether they work and how much they work, okay, that's not my area of expertise. So a lot of countries are grappling, do we make mask wearing mandatory, or do we leave it open to the person to have an individual right? So is it a state or a health, I see it as a health promotion intervention, or is it an individual? And from the little research that's already coming out, when it's left up to the individual, men don't wear masks. And again, this is a gross generalization. We're talking numbers here, of course. But in general, they don't wear masks as much as women. But once that it's a health promotion mandate, and this is kind of the should care vector pulling on that, it's very interesting that, of course, there's always, small minorities that are not going to wear the mask, but the mask wearing of men substantially increases, actually to the same level as women. So how do you negotiate that? I'm a health psychologist. I'm looking at how do we protect the health of people. And I think anything that can kind of address the normative change, this is just what we do when we care, when we should care. Anything that can pull on that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a terrifically important point. And I wonder whether we might also think again about the language of mental health that we use, and the way that might be more inclusive of people from different perspectives and backgrounds. And the reason that I bring that up is that I routinely teach classes of up to 50 students the theories and practice of psychotherapy. And in those classes, generally, there are only a handful of men, so somewhere of 2 to 3 to 4 men. And this is a concern. And I often speak about it with classes, but it's very difficult to come up with constructive responses. And clearly this is something that you're elaborating in a very sort of practical, real sense in terms of what we're experiencing now.
I mean, there has even been a suggestion, just following up on that, is that we shouldn't call psychotherapy psychotherapy. Call it coaching. And again, these are all kind of generalizations. Go for coaching. That's okay. Yeah, I could go for a coach. I can have, someone can give me advice. Someone can mentor me. So even if you just change the name of a service, it opens up an avenue for men to enter in a way that's not threatening and doesn't kind of go into that don't care, kind of feminized kind of route. So you're right, language is really important. And I think as psychologists and often healthcare providers, we've been a bit sloppy. And I think we need to create new language in order to help men engage, whether it's the men's sheds or calling it coaching, or just renaming things differently. Because as you know, there's a long history in France as well, just talking about Albert in the 1800s, of men doing things to women in terms of psychotherapy, even medical research. And we need to get away from that idea that it's men doing things to people. Women are more socialized to accept that, and I think it's harder for men to accept that. So anything that where we can remove that would really be helpful.
One commentator, Megan, has shared the following, actually from Vancouver Island, so close to where I am. That the building and construction trades are supporting mental health in all workers, the majority of whom are younger males, by holding mental health check-ins, which are short webinars on mental health issues such as anxiety that can be viewed during breaks at work.
It's a great example of what I was just talking about, the men's shed. So you take away some of the heaviness of like, oh, I'm like seeking psychotherapy. I'm going to work on my psyche. It's, something that can be in small bites that one can, attend to. I would suggest in those webinars that they kind of even play in the background. So you even have to remove the initiative to put the on button, that it's there. And, the person might not attend to it all, but they'll pick up something. So I think that's a really great initiative in the trades and construction industry on Vancouver Island. Kudos.
So here's another question from Ernst Schraube. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I have two questions. The vectors between not care, should care are not also women confronted with this ambivalence. Maybe young men are confronted with more serious culture vectors or ambivalencies. Any ideas what that could be? That's the first question.
Oh, okay. Well, I on purpose, I didn't get into women. that deserves a whole other talk. So I left women out and the whole issue of women's psychological health during the pandemic and how that's been really amplified, and the stresses from women being frontline workers. I think in some countries up to 80 to 90% of frontline workers, taking care of children, intimate partner violence. So there's a whole set of issues, different types of issues that women have to deal with. I think the vectors are different for women, if I'm remembering the question correctly. I think the not care vector is less dominant for women. And again, this is a generalization, but I think women have ambivalences as well, or tensions, or conflicting narratives. I thought I could make it through a talk without saying narrative, but obviously I can't. Conflicting narratives about, women are strong because they need to carry the burden of care for everybody, children, partners, patients in hospitals. But on the other hand, they're hysterical, to use an old-fashioned word. They can't control themselves. So they're also caught in vectors as well, slightly different, because I think cultures offer different options for men and women. But there's also stories and vectors that don't fit together that both men and women have to kind of figure out. And it's not always easy. It's not always easy. Yeah. I don't know if I answered that question. But
I think you did. There's a very brief follow-up question, then we have a number of others to go to, also by Ernst, and that is, do men have more difficulties with these ambivalencies, right? In other words, going back to those two vectors, and obviously, if so, why? Which is, I think you've already talked to a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of either or question. On the one hand, one of the ideas that I was suggesting in my talk is there are more options in some communities for men.
Mhm.
You know, I spoke about the young men having additional options, the different types of masculinity. That's a relatively new historical thing. It doesn't mean that it was always hegemonic in the past and there weren't fluctuations. Of course there were. But you know, so men have to kind of negotiate, okay, am I going to be this kind of male or that kind of male, or how is that going to be? And that's something that I think that particularly the young men of today are dealing with. Maybe not so much people that are, I don't know, 50 and older. I think maybe people that age got the beginnings of that, but that's just something so important for young men right now. But of course, I think women are dealing with it as well. How do I be an action-oriented, agentic woman where I should be passive, but actually I'm not, and I want to choose a different route. So I think the feminism part has been going on slightly longer. I'm going to really throw out an idea out there since maybe the 60s, at least in the North American context, whereas I think the masculine issues have come into the fore more in the 80s. And I think, you know, I didn't reference it so much in my talk, or not directly. I mean, there is what's called the patriarchy. There are structural issues in place. So men are negotiating their vectors or how they're going to be in the world. But patriarchy, that sociological structural issue, really does constrain the options available to women, perhaps in a way a little less so than for men.
Yeah.
So the same but different.
Same but different. And I really appreciate that point because one of the questions that often comes up for me is whether it's sufficient to change the language of mental health, and whether or not we don't need to focus those energies on changing the structures of patriarchy, which is of course a much longer term project, but certainly one worth engaging on, in at least as it shapes our understandings and responses within the mental health field.
Yeah, I agree.
We
But
have a
both
whole
through
series.
therapy, one could make aware the patriarchal in psychotherapy, even if one is doing feminist therapy with a man, one can work on these issues on that level as well. It's a small scale, but that's what clinical psychologists do on that level. So I think it doesn't have to be either or. I think psychologists can work on both levels. Yeah.
So Maria, there's a related question. Clearly, your use of these two vectors, the should care and don't care vectors, are creating a lot of interest in the viewers. And this one has to do, this is from Nicholas Shamiri, and my apologies if I mispronounce names. This has to do with the notion of care itself. Whether the idea of care as it exists in these two vectors is, in a sense, a colloquial understanding. And how do you account for perhaps differences in the colloquial understanding versus what a particular individual might experience in terms of care?
Right. I mean, the kind of the care, don't care vector comes really out of the health psychology literature, trying to understand men's treatment seeking. And I think in that tradition, it's really about, sounds like we could get into a big sociological discussion of how do you feel well in your body and in your mind? So we're not looking for happiness, as you know, but how do we feel well so we can do the things that we want to do in life? That's kind of a little Weasley answer, I know, but it's true. What is care? What is care to people? So for just to give you an example, it's well known when there's a couple, when there's a male and female couple, when the female becomes ill, the divorce rate skyrockets. But when the male partner is ill, there's not an increase in divorce. So there's very gendered conceptions of what care is.
Yes.
And it is so individual. And I'm not going to try to define it because that would kind of be against the whole thing. It's gender, it's social class, it's ethnicity, sexual orientation. It's really intersectional. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate your attempt to sort of break that down and define it, which is both extremely important and
Yeah.
always difficult to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a question from Alessandra Fusolo, and it refers back to your historical example. And you recalled that there was a negative judgment about people who traveled, which was one vector.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a return in cultural expectations of men to, quote, man up, perhaps also embodied by the new wave of politicians in power compared to the 70s or 80s, which is making things more difficult for contemporary young men?
I mean, there's been a lot of themes in many of the talks that I've attended about, metaphors of war and, we're in a battle. And so I think those metaphors to describe what's going on with this COVID crisis definitely draws on the kind of the more hegemonic kind of masculinity. Like, we don't have time for emotions now. We just have to do stuff. We have to cope, we have to take care of others, whatever care means. So I think, I think societies are really in a point of flux right now. So there's I think so many options open, and there's definitely that one pull to go back to kind of that more traditional kind of masculine, I'll call it hegemonic masculine vector. So I think that's why it's so important, for all of us to keep the door open and say, no, there are other options, and have solidarity together in our communities to resist that as much as possible.
Your talk about the masculine hegemonic vector, I think I would imagine for many viewers elicits images of certain world leaders at the moment.
Yeah, I tried not to say that. Roger, as a Canadian, we never talk about the neighbor to the south.
He who
In any
shall
kind
not
of
be
critical
named.
way.
But that also speaks, of course, to the enormous challenge when we have such leaders who dominate the media headlines to try to create a space for a different kind of language, right? And a different mode of being.
I agree. But it's let's just say one person, and that's taking up a lot of space. But it's really important to remember that it is one person.
Yeah.
There are other things going on. That's not the end all and be all of his constructed reality is not your constructed reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here's I think a really important question from Asif Adila, and that is that they're interested to know, how does this condition that you've discussed affect people who identify themselves as non-binary or transgender?
Yeah.
I understand how gender and social construction, like masculinity, works in your talk, but now I'm intrigued to see what or how you think this pandemic affects non-binary and transgendered people.
That's a great question, really great question. Just as an aside, I mean, I think people that define not as male or female in the traditional sense, it's a tough time. There's a lot of stigma still associated with those alternatives. From the literature that I've read, actually a lot of people don't want to go to the hospitals. They don't want to have to deal with this kind of issue. People that are going through even sex changes, people that are living a kind of non-traditional way. It's tough. A lot of them have been abandoned by their families. They're really isolated. So they have an additional level to cope with. A lot of people that are going through sex changes with hormones and so on, a lot of those kind of hormones are really bad really hard on the heart. And we know that that's something that the virus attacks. So I haven't seen any data yet. It's just too soon, but I imagine that they're really at risk for the virus, for having really extreme circumstances if they contract the virus. So it's some of the medical health stuff. But I mean, I think it's, I think, people that are in that group, I mean, they got it tough. They got the masculine vectors, they got the feminine vectors going on. So I think they have kind of almost like a double burden, a double gender burden, if we want to keep it as a categorical thing to deal with. So they have a kind of a really heavy mental load. And we know that it's tough. And if you look at the mental health clinics, there's a high rate of suicides, depression, anxiety in these groups already for the issues before the pandemic. So I think this is going to really amplify it for this group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, Maria, I think that's a really important response that you've been given to this question, and that is the way in which our reactions to situations in life are socially constructed by the options that we see around us. But what happens when we don't see options around us that conform or that correlate with our own experiences? Again, a previous question had focused on that difference between the cultural and the individual, right? How we navigate between those two.
Yeah, I mean, we have different options, and we don't all have access to the same options.
Yeah.
It's some options are more developed and others are less.
So here's another question that relates back to this notion of the man shed that you mentioned before, from Ryan Wasser. And so Ryan finds this concept highly interesting, especially as it relates to his work with veterans, as well as to the ideas and philosophers like Nietzsche, who notes that the attribute of men is opposed to women whose attribute is willingness. So we're talking again about these gendered ideas and conceptions. Could it be that the direction therapy, example, Michael Kimmel, I'm not familiar with that, but perhaps you are, and culture typically wants to lean towards regarding masculine individuals, including trans men, might be wholly inadequate for the development and maintenance of a masculine identity? Are men shed programs becoming more prevalent, and are they supported by the psychotherapeutic community?
There's a lot of stuff in that question.
Yes. Well, perhaps you'd like to take one idea that speaks to you. Certainly around, again, the men shed is a very powerful concept.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, men's sheds is an idea that started in Australia that has expanded across the world. So they are becoming more popular. Interestingly enough, as far as I'm aware, they are community organized. It is not a top-down process. It's not like a team of psychologists or social workers come in and organize this. There's usually someone in the community, a male, that has heard about this and finds this really interesting, and brings in his friends and brings in his friends. There is funding as a nonprofit. So it's really a bottom-up kind of tradition, but it's very interesting because I think that's what makes it so enticing. It's not like this is the psychotherapeutic space. And usually people that are kind of really involved in this option, and it's great now that it is an option. Someone thought of it. So now someone else can say, hey, that's a great option. Let's do that in our community. Sometimes it's just that idea that it's possible is the beginning. So there can be support, and this is kind of a more informal way, like, hey, Joe is just not himself these days. Maybe we can encourage Joe to see somebody now. So that kind of informal networking, looking out for someone. Joe's not himself. You can do, yeah, it's good, Joe. Yeah, go there. Just hearing that is so freeing. And hearing that, I think, for an older male, it's very freeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Maria, here's a question from Kailash in regards to gender differences in therapy and the ways in which they are different across cultures. So it speaks to your interest in your writing on the ways in which perhaps different cultures shape
Yeah,
our responses and experiences. And the statement is that in India, there are differences in therapy where a therapist has to keep in mind gender, culture, and to some extent the religious background of the client, as well as the socioeconomic background. So I think the question goes to what extent might these two care vectors, as you outline them, look different in different cultures? And certainly therapy itself looks different in different
absolutely.
cultures, because the concepts of therapy that we are talking about are very much grounded in sort
Yeah,
of the Western canon.
yeah. No, it's a great, great question. I mean, I don't know therapy in India very well. Actually, not at all, I must admit. But I was just thinking of, a community that I know that I've been privileged to enter to some extent, the Indigenous community in Canada. And many communities are suffering from mental health crisis, even before COVID. It's been tough. And part of the issue, especially for men in that community, is having their roles taken away from them. So rather than having a traditional psychotherapy, there's been a lot of resurgence of traditions and rituals and ways of being in Indigenous communities. Not labeled, it's not psychotherapy. It's traditions. It's things that people do. It's communal, and it's about care. Care for others that is highlighted. So, often in the Western notions, when we talk about care, and there's kind of refers to one of the earlier questions. I mean, where is care? Am I the care? Or in the Indigenous community, the care is more relational between
Yeah.
myself and the other.
Yeah.
So anything that can tap into that and rejuvenate traditions gets away from this whole care, don't care vector that is perhaps somewhat more prevalent in Western traditions. That being said, many Indigenous communities have suffered under patriarchy and colonialism and have adopted some of these Western notions themselves. So you have to be sensitive. It's a whole different way of thinking about the world. Yeah, it's a great question.
This is, I think, it's a nice segue to the next question, which is related to what you've just said. And it's from Gordana Jovanovic, and is again talking about the necessity of thinking about these vectors and the degree to which they might be experienced as rigid.
Mm-hmm.
And in one word, the question is, in one word, are you optimistic about possibilities for more pluralistic and less repressive cultural formative tools?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just want to kind of backtrack 1 second before I answer that question. Just some of the other questions. I mean, it's called cultural vectors for a reason. It's not called universal vectors. So it's very located in a time and a place. So I just want to emphasize that when we're talking about notions of care and vectors, I don't think Ian Hacking, and definitely I'm not arguing that either. I'm just pulling on that because there seems to be in a historical continuity in some of the Western cultures. So am I optimistic? Yes, I am. I am, because I do see just even the idea that one can have different options of masculinity and femininity is freeing. Some people have talked about the narrative imaginary or the narrative imagination. And to be able to think, what might that look like for myself and others to think in this way, to be in this way? So I think just that it is in the imaginary of a culture inevitably changes it. Maybe in this COVID thing, we will go back a little bit to kind of less options for men and women. But it's not, I hope not, but I don't think we're going to start from scratch again because they are still so present. And you can talk about them in therapy, you can talk about them in health clinics, but of course there's a lot of pushback right now. Yeah.
And Maria, thanks for that. I think that's a really important clarification, right? And that when you said that cultural vectors are not universal, they're culturally specific notions.
Yeah.
Of course, that then still always raises the question within that culturally specific context.
Yeah.
Can they shift? How do they shift? Can they become more pluralistic? And how might that go about it? And I think we've been talking about this on different levels.
Yeah,
On the level of performance and language, on the level of structure and the systemic forces that are at work, and on the individual level of lived experience, right? And
Yeah. Yes.
Of course, from a psychological and therapeutic perspective, they all come to bear. And I think you've spoken to each of them in different ways.
Yeah.
So there's a question and response from Mark Freeman. A really interesting, provocative talk, Maria. What I'm wondering is how external factors feed some of the difficulties you've identified. How, for instance, does the seemingly purposeful derealization of reality itself that we see in the United States feed those who are already prone to their own internal derealization?
Yeah.
Also, how might those with self-serving instrumental motives, perhaps wanting to win an election, tap into some of the gendered pathologies you've identified and use them for his or her own ends?
Yeah.
So I think there are two related questions there.
Yeah. I mean, the neighbor to the south definitely is tapping into some of those gendered pathologies. And there's always going to be a group that is more or less vulnerable to this. You know, I mentioned the very first case of a hallucination including or involving COVID. So it's a cultural issue, a cultural narrative that is being tapped into right here. I think I kind of forget the first part of the question. Could you?
Sure, I'm happy to read it again.
Yeah.
How, for instance, does the seeming purposeful derealization of the itself that we see in the United States feed those who are already prone to their own internal derealization?
I think it amplifies it. I think I did kind of answer it. I think it amplifies it. People have a vulnerability to it. It's open. Not everybody, but it definitely is kind of like a looping effect. I definitely see it as a looping effect where they feed on each other and they feed on each other. I mean, if there wasn't an audience, that one person wouldn't have all this airtime. There's definitely an audience for it. So this depersonalization, this derealization, it's not just it's a cultural vector as well, if you want to call it that. It's not just an individual issue. It's also a societal cultural issue that's being tapped into, for sure. Yeah.
And in that same sense, now the question was how self-serving instrumental motives on the part of politicians tap into some of those gendered pathologies. right? And make use of those gender's pathologies. And I think you've, in a sense, just said that.
Just the war metaphors that we've heard a few times in the conference here. It's a very gendered metaphor. We're at war, or
Right.
we're at war with another political party. We're at war with wearing masks. There's no end to kind of extending those metaphors, and there is a population that is willing to hear that. But again, I think it's really important to remember that there's a whole other realm or layer that sometimes is called the silent majority. That's there, that's doing great things, that is coming together, that is trying to counteract. And we maybe don't hear enough about that because of concentration of the media, all kinds of reasons, lots of capitalist interests. We might as well put in capitalism into the talk as well. So I think we hear that narrative a lot more, unfortunately, than some of the other narratives, the more subversive narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Eliana. And again, thanking you for an intriguing talk and thinking some more about care, understanding, and support. She's suggesting that as she understands it, the family support is especially important for young men.
Yeah.
But how do we deal with this when the lines between home and outside are blurred? And home is not very comforting and supportive in terms of health and maintaining healthy habits.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one of the challenges of this period of confinement or lockdown. Some people are too isolated. There is nobody there. They're on their own. I've had students that have just been in Paris that have been on their own, that have found it challenging. And yet, on the other hand, we have people that, well, there's just too many bodies here. It's and I can't get away, and I can't get any space. So, I mean, I think it's something that we're all negotiating to some extent, not just young men. I think it's really tough, as I brought out in my talk, it's really tough for young men because there's this vector of like, be active, do stuff, just don't sit around and ruminate. On the other hand, it's like, well, yeah, you should sit around and ruminate. So that's, so what do you want me to do? So, I mean, I think the thing is communal activities, whether it be with friends through the internet, families doing stuff together. Having the family talk around the table is probably a horror. Let's talk as a family about what's going on. It's probably the ultimate horror. But let's play a video game and have a little bit of chit chat back and forth. That's probably going to go down a lot better. So I think it's finding ways to support young men where they are, and helping them develop a language to articulate it as the best that parental figures can do, or professors, or any sorts of figures. I think that is really important. It sounds so simple in some respects, but it's actually really hard and so fundamentally key.
Yeah.
No,
I appreciate your saying that. Megan, who I believe was the person who had the question from Vancouver Island, had a follow-on question. And it's also related to, I think, what you just said. And the question was, what are some potential positive effects of the social distancing on mental health?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a sort of an interesting counter perspective.
Yeah. What are some of the positive effects? I think, from what I've read, and there's not a lot yet because, sadly, you don't hear about that in the media. That's what I said. You always hear certain storylines in the media of things, and you don't hear about maybe some of the positive things. It almost sounds like an oxymoron to say there could be positive outcomes. You know, people, families, for example, the baking bread, literally, quite literally baking bread together, kind of that activity that I mentioned, doing things together, being creative, um, having perhaps the time, if you're lucky enough. I mean, I want to kind of say not everyone's lucky enough for this. I want to emphasize there's a lot of people that wish they were in confinement, that could be in confinement, healthcare workers, people working in grocery stores, you know, transit drivers, delivery people. So, you know, I think in some sociological way, you have to remember that being in lockdown is a privilege.
Yes,
Um,
I think that's a crucial
yeah,
point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even having a place to be in confinement is a privilege. A lot of people don't have that around the world.
Yeah.
But if you have that privilege, I think, you know, I'm still wanted to read War and Peace. I haven't gotten to it yet, but it's still on my on my list, on my bucket list for confinement once the conference is over. But I think the space, a lot of people have used this to really reflect on, my life has gone this way, and it just seemed like there was no other option, sort of the rat race. I've done it, I've done it, I've done it, I've done it. And hey, wait a minute. Maybe I don't have to do it this way. And
Mhm.
actually having a bit of time and space to mull it over, it takes time.
Mhm.
And from what I've read, some people have been lucky enough to kind of go, you know, I think I want to do things differently in the future. I don't have to do it this way. So I think that is one really positive outcome of this confinement, which can be so negative at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's very nicely said.
Yeah,
So we have just a few minutes left, and
sure.
there's one other question, and there is some relation to what you just said, certainly in terms of reflection and in terms of self-understanding, and this one actually relates to religion. Right?
Mhm.
And of course, the way that religion is practiced is in social gatherings. So, how might you explain the mental state of religious leaders that, despite the evidence of COVID-19 contamination, still encourage congregations to attend such gatherings, bearing in mind that there are other options available? And what is the mental state of those who attend those services, believing that they are safe? What might this tell us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Actually a question that I ask myself a lot as well. Um, I think one has to remember, and it's not all religious services that are doing this. By
Mhm.
far, a lot of religious places of worship have moved to Zoom, um, having it in cars. I was reading, is car culture making a big comeback because you can sit in your car, kind of like the old drive-in where you have a little speaker and you can kind of have the religious um, um, talked there. I mean, it's. I kind of see it almost as a, to kind of get back to Marx. It's almost like a sort of dissociative derealization of what's going on. I see it as a way to cope, a way to keep control. Our world is really changing beneath us right now. This is kind of a, you know, one in a generation thing. And I think it's a way of coping, you know. We can just carry on. Nothing's changed. Don't panic. We can just go on as normal. It's all going to be okay. You'll see in 6 months, it will all be fine. It will all be over and life will go on as we know it. So it's really a way of holding on to the concrete or holding on to something for quite literally dear life. So that's the way I would understand it, as a way of coping.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time, so I thank you very much for your I think, very clear and detailed answers to all these various questions. And as well, Maria, just your great talk. You covered a lot of different territory, but you also, I think, brought to the fore the fact that we overlook these very gendered aspects of experience, especially in the midst of these social crises. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you so much for moderating, Roger. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thanks.